There's something buried deep inside you, something you've spent years avoiding medicating or trying to forget. It whispers in your sleepless nights, surfaces in your sudden outbursts, and shapes every relationship you enter. You've tried therapy, meditation, positive thinking, and countless self-help strategies, yet that familiar ache remains, that sense of incompleteness that no external achievement can fill. What if I told you that your refusal to truly face this buried pain is the very thing keeping you trapped? That your sophisticated avoidance strategies are actually feeding the beast? You're trying to starve. Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, despite their famous disagreements, understood something about trauma that modern psychology often overlooks. Healing doesn't come from forgetting or moving on, but from diving deep into the darkness you've been running from your entire life. You've been living under a dangerous illusion, one that promises healing through avoidance, growth through denial, and peace through forgetting. But trauma doesn't disappear. When ignored, it goes underground, where it operates like a puppet master, pulling the strings of your behavior, your relationships, and your deepest fears. Every unexplained anxiety attack, every pattern you can't break, every wall you can't seem to tear down traces back to that original wound you refuse to acknowledge. The truth is brutal, but liberating. You will never heal until you stop running from what happened to you and start running toward it, with the fierce curiosity of someone who refuses to live as a victim of their own unconscious. Your trauma is not your enemy. It's your teacher, your guide, and paradoxically, your greatest potential source of power. But first, you must be willing to look it in the eye. Freud discovered something that would revolutionize our understanding of human suffering. We don't just forget traumatic experiences, we actively repress them. The mind, in its desperate attempt to protect us from overwhelming pain, buries these experiences so deep that we lose conscious access to them. But this protective mechanism comes with a terrible cost. What we bury alive continues to live, to grow, and to influence us from the shadows of the unconscious. Think about your own patterns, the ones that seem to repeat, no matter how hard you try to change them. The way you sabotage relationships just as they're getting serious. The inexplicable rage that erupts over minor inconveniences. The chronic anxiety that has no apparent source. The persistent feeling that you're not enough, that you're somehow fundamentally flawed. These aren't character defects or personal failings. They're symptoms of unprocessed trauma, messages from your unconscious mind, trying to heal wounds you won't acknowledge. Freud called this the return of the repressed, the way buried trauma finds alternate routes to the surface, disguising itself as symptoms, compulsions, and self-destructive behaviors. You think you've moved past what happened to you, but in reality, you've simply taught it to speak in a different language. Your body keeps the score through chronic tension, mysterious illnesses, and physical symptoms that have no medical explanation. Your relationships replay the same dynamics, attracting partners who trigger the same wounds, or pushing away those who might actually heal them. The compulsion to repeat is one of the cruelest aspects of unresolved trauma. You find yourself in the same type of toxic relationship, making the same self-defeating choices, experiencing the same emotional pain over and over again. This isn't masochism or bad luck. It's your psyche's desperate attempt to master an experience it couldn't process the first time. Each repetition is an unconscious effort to gain control over the original helplessness, to rewrite the ending of a story that feels unfinished. But here's where Jung's insight becomes crucial. While Freud focused on what trauma does to us, Jung understood what we must do with trauma. He saw that our wounds, when properly integrated, become our greatest sources of wisdom and strength. The very experiences that shattered us can become the foundation of a deeper, more authentic self, but only if we're willing to consciously engage with them rather than letting them operate from the shadows. Jung introduced the concept of the shadow, that part of ourselves we've rejected, denied, or refused to acknowledge. For trauma survivors, the shadow often contains not just the painful memories themselves, but the parts of ourselves that were present during those experiences. The frightened child, the helpless victim, the one who was overwhelmed and couldn't fight back. We spend enormous energy trying to distance ourselves from these aspects of our identity, but in doing so, we fragment ourselves and lose access to our full power. The path to healing requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, the ability to contain both your strength and your vulnerability, your power and your helplessness, your light and your shadow. This is not about wallowing in victimhood or reliving trauma for its own sake. It's about integrating these experiences into a more complete understanding of who you are, transforming your wounds from sources of shame into sources of wisdom. Most people approach trauma healing backwards. They want to feel better before they do the work, to be healed before they face the wound. But Jung understood that true healing requires a descent into darkness before any ascent into light. You must be willing to feel worse before you feel better, to touch the pain you've been avoiding, to have conversations with the parts of yourself you've been trying to forget. This process is what Jung called active imagination, the practice of consciously engaging with the contents of your unconscious mind rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. Instead of being haunted by your past, you become the investigator of your own psyche. You dialogue with your trauma. Ask it what it needs. Understand its message. You stop seeing yourself as a victim of your past and start seeing yourself as an archaeologist of your own soul. The resistance you feel to this process is not weakness. It's your psyche's way of protecting you from overwhelming pain. But what was once protective has now become restrictive. The walls you built to keep the pain out are now keeping your full self in. The survival mechanisms that once saved you are now sabotaging you. The hypervigilance that protected you as a child now prevents you from trusting as an adult. Freud observed that we often prefer familiar suffering to unfamiliar healing because at least the suffering is predictable. You know how to live with your pain, how to manage your symptoms, how to organize your life around your limitations. But you don't know who you might become if you were truly free. This fear of the unknown keeps many people trapped in cycles of partial healing, getting just comfortable enough to avoid the deeper work, but never breaking through to genuine transformation. The deepest trauma often occurs not from what happened to us, but from what didn't happen. The love we didn't receive, the safety we weren't given, the validation that never came. These are the wounds of omission rather than commission, and they're often the hardest to identify and heal because there's no specific event to point to, no clear perpetrator to blame. Instead, there's a persistent sense of emptiness, of something missing, of never quite being enough. Jung understood that we must learn to become our own good parent, to give ourselves what we didn't receive in childhood. This isn't about excusing our parents or pretending the wounds don't matter. It's about taking responsibility for our own healing, recognizing that while we couldn't control what happened to us, we can control what we do with what happened to us. The process of trauma integration requires what Freud called working through the slow, often painful process of repeatedly examining the same wound from different angles until it loses its power to control us. This isn't a one-time event, but a gradual transformation that happens through consistent engagement with our pain. Each time we consciously face what we've been avoiding, we reclaim a piece of our power that was lost in the original trauma. But here's the paradox that both Jung and Freud understood: the goal of trauma work isn't to eliminate suffering, but to transform it from meaningless pain into meaningful struggle. When we avoid our trauma, we suffer without purpose, becoming victims of forces we don't understand. When we engage with our trauma consciously, we suffer with purpose, becoming heroes of our own journey toward wholeness. The wounded healer is one of the most powerful archetypes in human experience. Those who have faced their deepest pain and integrated it consciously often become the most effective helpers of others. Their wounds become their gifts, their pain becomes their purpose, their trauma becomes their teacher. But this transformation is only possible when we stop running from our past and start learning from it. Your trauma is not just something that happened to you. It's something that's still happening in you every day through your unconscious patterns, your triggered responses, your defensive behaviors. Every time you overreact to a minor criticism, you're reliving an old wound. Every time you sabotage a good opportunity, you're protecting yourself from a danger that no longer exists. Every time you feel that familiar emptiness or rage or terror, you're being visited by an unintegrated piece of your past. The revolutionary insight of depth psychology is that these symptoms are not problems to be eliminated, but messages to be decoded. Your anxiety is trying to tell you something about safety. Your depression is trying to tell you something about grief. Your anger is trying to tell you something about boundaries. Your trauma responses are primitive forms of communication from parts of yourself that never learned more sophisticated ways to express their needs. Jung believed that what we resist persists, but what we embrace transforms. When you stop fighting your trauma and start listening to it, something miraculous happens. The very experiences that seem to destroy you begin to reveal their hidden gifts. The sensitivity that made you vulnerable as a child becomes empathy that helps you connect with others as an adult. The hypervigilance that exhausted you becomes an intuitive ability to read situations and people. The emotional intensity that overwhelmed you becomes passion that fuels your purpose. But this transformation requires something most people are unwilling to give: complete honesty about what actually happened and how it actually affected you. No minimizing, no rationalizing, no, it wasn't that bad, or others had it worse. Your pain deserves to be acknowledged in all its reality, without comparison or justification. The child who was hurt deserves to have their experience validated, not dismissed. The deepest healing happens when we stop trying to convince ourselves that our trauma wasn't traumatic and start allowing ourselves to feel the full impact of what we endured. This isn't about blame or self-pity, it's about truth. And truth, no matter how painful, is always more liberating than the lies we tell ourselves to avoid discomfort. Freud discovered that symptoms often serve multiple functions. They express the original trauma while simultaneously defending against it. Your panic attacks might be reliving the terror you felt as a child, while also ensuring you avoid situations that might trigger that terror again. Your people-pleasing might be recreating the conditional love you experienced, while also trying to prevent abandonment. Your workaholism might be proving your worth, while also avoiding the vulnerability of intimate relationships. Understanding the secondary gains of your symptoms is crucial for healing. Part of you is invested in staying wounded because your wounds serve a purpose, even if that purpose is ultimately self-destructive. You must be willing to give up these familiar strategies, even if they've protected you, to make room for healthier ways of being in the world. The ultimate goal of trauma work is not to become invulnerable, but to become more fully human. It's not about eliminating all pain, but about developing the capacity to hold pain without being destroyed by it. It's not about forgetting what happened, but about remembering it in a way that empowers rather than enslaves you. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain and trauma. Work exemplifies this truth. The very experiences that wounded you also have the potential to awaken you to depths of strength, compassion, and wisdom you never knew you possessed. But this potential can only be realized through conscious engagement with your pain, not avoidance of it. Your trauma is not your fate, it's your raw material. What you make of it depends entirely on your willingness to face it, feel it, understand it, and ultimately integrate it into a more complete version of yourself. The path through trauma is not around the wound, but through it. not despite the pain, but because of what lies hidden within it. The time for running is over. The time for healing has begun. But true healing requires something you may have never tried: the courage to stop being afraid of your own story and start being curious about what it's trying to teach you. Your wounds are not your weakness. They're your way forward, but only if you're brave enough to turn toward them instead of away.